It's Monday, the 5th of December. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Henry Smith, Labour MP Ben Bradshaw, Nancy Fielder, who's Editor-in-Chief of National World, and Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens. Today,
I argued for Remain, but I couldn't disagree with the basic case that lots of Leave voters made to me.
the Labour leader embraces Brexit as he makes his pitch to change the way the UK is governed.
For people who enter the country illegally, we would say that there is absolutely no right to settle here in the future.
Does Theresa May's former advisor have the policies to stem the flow of Channel migrants?
We can overcome our planet's greatest challenges. And by supporting and scaling them, we can change our future.
Should onshore wind farms be part of the solution to climate change? A rail union rejects a pay offer worth 8% over 2 years as the Conservative Party chairman delivers this message to striking workers.
They should reflect on this because that is exactly what Putin wants to see, that division.
Well, you just heard Nadeem Zahawi there at the end of the headlines, responding to the forthcoming strikes by railway workers and nurses, amongst others, saying people should rethink and reflect on strike action because it's exactly what Vladimir Putin wants to see. Let's not divide, let's come together. Is he right?
Well, of course, Putin is no friend of this country and he wants disruption. But what I'm most concerned about is my commuters and those people who are wanting to travel around the country at Christmas time to see family. So that's why I hope that these rail strikes will be called off. Right.
But is he right in what he says about this is what Putin wants to see in terms of people here being on strike?
Well, look, Putin's no friend of this country, as I say. Of course he wants disruption here, but I think we should focus on the issue of trying to resolve these rail strikes so that people can get to work, people can see their families.
Rather than Nadeem Zahawi's words. Is he right? Should we all be coming together? It's a sort of war effort.
I don't think that minister has ever been involved in any industrial negotiation from what he said. I mean, that is exactly the kind of thing that's going to make a deal less likely. I mean, the poor new Transport Secretary, whose name I've also forgotten because they change every 5 minutes, must be absolutely furious. What you need to do is the two sides coming round the table, facilitated by the government, to get a deal to end the misery that the travelling public are putting up with.
And the 8% offer over 2 years?
I'm not going to get involved in a negotiation. That's not my job. I'm an opposition backbencher.
I wasn't asking for a negotiation. I was just asking for whether you thought it was reasonable or not.
It's the job of the government to allow the rail companies to make a deal. As far as I'm aware, this was the first time the rail operating companies had actually made a deal. This has been going on for months. Where's the government been?
Well, where's the government been, Henry?
Well, this is a dispute between the rail operators and the rail unions, and I hope that they can get round a table and resolve this dispute, because at the end of the day, it is my commuters, I commute myself from my constituency, yes, who suffer being home late and, of course, in the Christmas context, not being able to go and visit family, which, after 2 years of restrictions visiting family because of COVID, I think is particularly cruel.
Is it right for Nadeem Zahawi, Nancy, to say to people who are going to go on strike, this is exactly what Putin wants to see?
No, this is divisive politics designed to split the people. Let's talk about why they're on strike, because it's not just about money, it's about safety on the trains. And actually, people are avoiding the trains anyway because the network is embarrassingly bad. It's crippled, it's broken. The strike makes it worse. I'm not hiding from that. But actually, the system needs looking at. The government needs to deal with the problem rather than trying to divide us all, as they always do.
What did you make of his words, Peter, and do you think it'll have any impact?
It was comical. And I spent many of my early years in Fleet Street covering industrial disputes, and this sort of thing is completely and utterly counterproductive. productive and absurd anyway. I doubt whether Vladimir Putin even knows that we have any rail strikes. He doesn't care. They're not that into us in Russia. They don't care. I lived in Russia for a couple of years and they didn't care about Britain very much. They tend to have very old-fashioned Dickensian ideas about how we live. They probably think we have steam trains. It isn't an issue for them. It's an absurd way of trying to make people look bad when they're not. The reason for these strikes is the inflation. The reason for the inflation is the wild panic into which the government got over COVID, in which it destroyed the economy and visited inflation. And people can now be expected to use their industrial power to get what they can back from the inflation, and the rail unions do this. But the government has been, since it launched the fantasy capitalism of railway privatisation all those years ago, been shoveling money by the ton into the pockets of train operating companies. Why won't it shovel money into the pockets of people who work on the railways to get the strike over? It's not. It simply isn't true to say that the government is a neutral actor in this. The railways are in reality a nationalised industry, and they have to sort it out. And it's not reasonable to behave like this.
Do you want to respond to what Peter's just said?
Well, I think Peter's absolutely right. The government have shovelled huge amounts of money into the rail industry.
So why not into the railway workers?
And particularly during COVID, and absolutely we're seeing one of the reasons of inflation is because of the mass spending and the economy being closed down for the best part of 2 years. I hope that a solution can be found, because at the end of the day, it's ordinary people who suffer.
All right, let's talk about Labour, because they've released a report. It's been written by the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown on reforms to the UK's political system. We're going to talk to the BBC's political correspondent Nick Eardley to tell us more. What did it say, and what has Keir Starmer had to say in response to it this morning?
Hi, Joe. There's almost two parts to this story. There's the chunky report, 155 pages from Gordon Brown, which goes into all sorts of ideas about how you can transfer power throughout the UK, abolish the House of Lords, take civil servants out of London, give local government more power to raise money, potentially through taxes. There's that part which has a lot in it and is pretty radical in some parts. Then there's what the Labour Party is actually promising to do, because it's not saying, all right, we'll take that report and implement it all. It's saying we're now going to look through the detail and figure out what we want to promise people and when exactly we'll do it. Now, Sir Keir Starmer is saying this morning that he's going to have a massive transfer of power away from here, away from Westminster, across the UK, to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but also to the English regions. But when it comes to the specifics of what the Labour Party is going to do, there aren't all that many just yet.
While you're here, let's talk about Brexit, because Keir Starmer was interviewed on the BBC's Today programme this morning, and he was asked about it. Let's just take a listen, first of all.
There's no case for going back to the EU or going back into the single market. I do think there's a case for a better Brexit. I do think there's a very strong case for making Brexit work. Look, I argue for Remain, as everybody knows. We left, and having left, there is no case now for saying go back. And going into the single market and customs union, we've had this debate endlessly over the years 2016 to 19 is effectively going back in.
That was Keir Starmer. What's he actually trying to do here, Nick?
Trying to move on from Brexit and not talk about it as much as he can is the simple answer. I mean, there's an acknowledgement in the Labour Party that it is a bit of an Achilles heel for Keir Starmer, and it probably will come up at the next general election. So I think it's a bit of a preemptive strike, actually, saying very early on we don't want to revisit the big issues like rejoining the single market. We just want a better Brexit deal. It is a tricky one for him, though, because he also said in that interview that there were no benefits to be had economically from rejoining the single market, which I think a lot of economists would question. And it is one of those issues that's still a bit divisive within some parts of the Labour Party, and it leaves a lot of people who maybe want closer relationship with the European Union, still wondering where their political home is.
Nick Eardley, thank you very much. Ben, is Keir Starmer right to say we're not rejoining, we wouldn't advocate rejoining the single market?
Totally right. You couldn't get a stronger Remainer than me. I campaigned flat out for Remain in the referendum. I campaigned against a hard Brexit in Parliament. I argued for a confirmatory referendum. We lost. And he's in absolutely the right place. But what he needs to do, and he didn't, if you listen to the whole of that interview, which of course I did, is he went on to list a whole range of things that the next Labour government will do to improve the disastrous deal that Boris Johnson negotiated. That's where the Labour Party should be. Show people how by improving your relations with our nearest neighbours and most important trading partners, you can improve their lives. That will then change the nature of the debate. But for the next Parliament, for the next election, he's in absolutely the right place.
So Ben and Keir Starmer are converts to making Brexit work. But Peter, is Keir Starmer right to say there would be no sort of benefits to economic growth by membership of the single market?
I don't think he is. I mean, as someone who from the start thought we should have stayed in the single market and taken the Norway option, I'm baffled that option has been so little explored. Some way or other, I think, will eventually have to be found of getting at least some of the benefits of being in the single market and stopping being a third country with all the enormous bureaucratic...
And you supported Brexit?
Well, no, I didn't vote for it. I didn't campaign for it. I didn't like the look of the campaign, and I stayed out of it. Like my old friend Christopher Booker, who wrote the book about why this country should leave the European Union. I thought that the form that it was taking was dangerous, and it was a mistake to leave the single market, and I still think so. I don't think we can go back into it directly, but I think probably some form of salami slicing will take place, which effectively gets us back into it. We will move from being half in the European Union to being half out of it, which is what I always predicted would happen anyway.
And what do you say in response to Peter, Henry, in terms of the benefits of rejoining, even if we didn't do it directly, that there are benefits to rejoining the single market?
Well, I think that the main benefits are those global trade agreements that this country has signed over 70, and I think can develop more of those. I think one of the great strengths of this country has always been the proximity to Europe and yet our unique global connections. I mean, it is interesting that Keir Starmer is saying that he now accepts Brexit 6 years after the referendum result. I welcome that. I think it's probably got more to do with political and electoral expediency than it does some sort of conversion in terms of...
If I have this right, George Eustice recently apologised for the Australia agreement.
That's the former
minister. I mean, these deals have been hopeless. They're a fraction of the trade we've lost from leaving the single market. Right. Peter's absolutely right. Leaving the single market has done us economic damage. But the heroic assumption is that if we wanted to go back, Europe would let us in.
Well, there is that difficulty.
You know, it's pie in the sky.
But that's not the same thing. That's not the same thing, though, is it? Ben is saying that there are no benefits to economic growth, because as you are saying, even the OBR, the Oxford Budget Responsibility, says the economy is going to be 4% smaller than if we were in the...
And I exactly accept that. But if you're hoping to be Prime Minister after the next election, you have to be realistic about what you can deliver. And the idea that any government after the next election could suddenly turn around to Europe and say, oh, we're terribly sorry, we've made a terrible mistake, we'd like to rejoin the single market. I mean, after the way they've been treated by Boris Johnson, the complete destruction of trust, the destruction of our good relations, that is what Keir Starmer's going to have to focus on doing, rebuilding our relations with our most important trading partner, show the benefits of that, and then who knows what might happen in 10, 20 years' time.
Henry?
Well, I think this is somewhat of a false argument. The reason why there is economic stagnation and recession isn't to do with Brexit. We're seeing it around the world, whether it's in Japan, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in the single market. All the economic indicators around the world are definitely on a downward trajectory, and that is a direct result of two things. It's a result of COVID, and it's a result of to an extent, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the energy situation that has produced. So I think, you know, we need to remind ourselves of exactly why we're in the economic difficult and challenging times that we are.
Well, hang on, let me bring that...
Just one small thing. People say of COVID. It's not of COVID. It's the government's reaction
to COVID,
which was a grave mistake, as we increasingly learn.
Do you think Keir Starmer's right by ruling out, to a certain extent, the idea of rejoining the single market?
Yeah, I mean, I never wanted to leave the EU, but now is not the time. This country is on its knees, and there are problems that have been exacerbated by COVID. But let's remember why people voted for Brexit, because they wanted immigration under control. not happen. They wanted the NHS. There's hundreds of millions going to be flooded in, and it's much worse, made worse by COVID, but not created by COVID, these problems. There is nothing that we've seen that is better post-Brexit, but we've got massive problems, haven't we? We need to focus on other things. Now is not the time for another vote.
But it is interesting that Labour still has the policy of what's called a veterinary agreement between the EU and the UK in order to have more frictionless trade. That is signing up to EU rules and standards, isn't it?
Yes, I think and I think you'll see more of this, and I don't know whether you had the chance to read Tony Blair's report last week, but I think it set out a list of very practical measure steps that the future Labour government could take to improve our relations, improve the economy and improve trade. And some of those would regain some of the benefits of the single market, but without being in the single market. And I think that's the crucial difference.
Right, so is that, though, what people voted for when they voted for Brexit?
Well, the trouble is, we don't really know what... Some people voted for Brexit because of immigration. A lot of people voted for Brexit because they were told by the Brexiteers we wouldn't leave the single market or the customs union. So, you know, who knows? And people voted for different reasons. But we are where we are, Joe, and the next Labour Prime Minister has to be realistic about what is achievable. And as Nancy's just said, what are their priorities? Huge challenges that we're going to be facing, the mess to clear up that this lot will have left us. So it's not going to be a priority. Yes, let's make things better and help the economy, but not start that argument all over again.
I mean, it does sound like it could be rejoining the single market, not directly, but perhaps by stealth over 10 or 20 years, as Ben Bradshaw is saying. What would be wrong with that? What are the benefits of Brexit thus far?
Well, I think, you know, we need to live up to the rhetoric in that if you accept the referendum results, you have to make sure that you are looking for a good relationship with the European Union and the rest of Europe, and good relationships using our unique global links around the world. So I think that's what we need to focus on. And I suspect, as I said, this is more about electoral expediency to try and detoxify Labour's problem with Brexit. So that is put to one side. I suspect under a future Labour government, we would see not so much salami slicing, but huge chunks being reversed. And I think we would see a very different situation as a result of there being a Labour government in terms of the approach to essentially rejoining many of the EU institutions by stealth.
The toxic culture is not the Labour Party, it is Westminster. It's not seen in the country as one particular party. This is a Brexit issue that is toxic for every single MP, I'm afraid. That's just what it is. The outside world looks on different than Westminster as Westminster looks out.
Peter?
It just makes me think that David Cameron really does deserve the title of the worst Prime Minister in modern history.
There's a fight for that one.
Everything that he did was just disastrous. He's even worse than Blair was, and it's an extraordinary thing. But this mess
leaving your competition to who's the worst Prime Minister.
Since you want to know, that's what I think.
Well, and it is what you think. That was very clear. Let's have a look at this headline then in the Times. You mentioned Westminster. Scrap Lords for Senate of the Regions, Starmer told. This is part of the report that was commissioned for Gordon Brown. A House of Lords would be elected. It would be smaller, democratically elected second chamber. Should it be abolished, Ben?
Well, changed. I mean, what's the definition? That would be abolishing it as it is now, but still having a second chamber that's democratically elected and accountable. Look, a lot of this, and I haven't had a chance to read Gordon's 155 pages, a lot of this is unfinished business from the last time we were in government. We did do Lords reform, but we only did half of it.
Yes.
Well, we got rid of the hereditary.
Yes, you did.
And, you know, you have... Again, it goes back to what is possible. Politics is the art of the possible and the deliverable. And, you know, in an ideal world, we wouldn't invent this country as we have it. However, it's about what you can do in government to make things work better. And I think where Keir is absolutely right is that our politics is not working for the whole country. It's not delivering for the whole country. As Nancy was saying, it's far too London-centric. And, you know, we suffer as a democracy and as an economy because of that.
Is the House of Lords indefensible, which is the word that has been used, in the way it is currently constituted?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the fact that it's so focused on London. But again, I'd hate to sound like a stuck record, because it's really important that we do long-term decisions, and actually all politicians seem afraid of that. It's always about the next election, so this is really important. But in everyday lives, in the most of this country now, this is completely irrelevant. It's how we feed our kids, it's how we pay electricity bills. So this debate is really important, but actually, again, is it the right time? Why are we talking about it now? Why are we not tackling food banks and the key issues? Why is the country on strike?
Well, House of Lords was defensible until they got rid of the hereditaries. It was a brilliant system under which most of the members of the House of Lords owed nothing to any government. And the illustration of that was the almost total absence of power of the whips. The whips who enforced the will of the executive on members of Parliament all the time, quite brutally, had no power in the Lords. If the Lords wanted to reject what the government wanted to do because it was stupid or wrong, they could do so. They didn't do it enough, but they did do it. And the hereditaries were the backbone of that. And Labour, by getting rid of them, effectively disemboweled the Lords. And what we have now is a ludicrous chamber of cronies, which is far too big and unwieldy. And the idea of replacing it with a democratically elected chamber is incredibly dangerous. You have two democratically elected chambers competing against each other.
Well, I invite Peter to imagine being a Foreign Office Minister, going around the world lecturing people about human rights and democracy, coming from a country whose second chamber is consisting almost entirely of people who owe their job there to the fact that their father bombed to form a monarch.
I would never lecture anybody about human rights because I don't believe they exist. And
well, yeah, but what about the point that Ben's making?
The United States Senate was not elected until 1915. It was deliberately designed to copy the House of Lords to be free from what was called the fury of democracy. It's a perfectly good idea to have a non-elected second chamber, and one which I think we're very foolish to get rid of. Now we have got rid of it. To replace it with an elected second chamber will be a constitutional disaster. Imagine having two elected chambers fighting each other.
Well, two elected chambers. What do you think of the idea?
Well, I've always advocated House of Lords, or second chamber, I should say, reform. I think it's an anathema that our Parliament should be made up of people who are either there because of birth or there because they have been appointed, because they've received received a favour. To be honest, Ben, that cut's always in the House of Lords. Let's not any illusions that appointments to the House of Lords are somehow just a Conservative issue. There are lots of Labour examples. So I'm in favour of House of Lords or second chamber reform. I'm slightly uneasy at the idea of some sort of chamber of the regions. It seems like replacing one appointment system with another appointment system. I either think you have direct election or you have no second chamber at all. But one of the things I'd like to just briefly talk about is the idea of devolution as well. We've had devolution to local government for the last 25 years, through the Blair and Brown years, through the Conservative years as well. I was a county council leader during the Blair and Brown years. There was no devolution to us. It was always the Labour heartland. So I suspect we're seeing more of the same.
Is this a priority, though? House of Lords reform, or abolishing it as it's currently set up and having a democratically elected chamber?
I completely agree with Nancy. It's not the issue that's going to win Labour in the next election. Right. It's not what people are talking about on the doorstep or in the dog and duck. But it is still important to do, I think Keir used the term to rewire our country. You need to do both, because I think one of the mistakes that Tony Blair made when he was Prime Minister is he lost interest in constitutional reform and modernisation. I think our country still needs it now. It needed it then. It needs it even more now. So Keir's right to do it. Get this issue out of the way now before the general election. It gives us plenty of time to talk about the kind of issues, Nancy, that you and I want to talk about.
Let's have a look at this headline. It's a priority, the government keeps saying in the Daily Mail. Home Secretary Suella Braverman vows to stop migrants gaming anti-slavery laws as report urges ban on people coming from safe countries such as Albania, claiming asylum to settle in Britain. This is a report by the Centre for Policy Studies, a right-of-centre think tank. They've come up with a set of proposals and the Home Secretary has written the foreword to that report. You will know various reports on this programme saying around 44,000 people have arrived in the UK in small boats across the Channel. The former Home Office advisor and Chief of Staff to Theresa May when she was Home Secretary and Prime Minister is Nick Timothy. He is one of the authors of the report. I spoke to him earlier.
At its heart, what we're proposing is a fairly simple deal where we should introduce resettlement schemes where we can bring people directly to Britain safely and legally, capped, we think, in a normal year at 20,000, although Parliament might be able to increase that limit if it wished. But then for people who enter the country illegally, we would say that there is absolutely no right to settle here in the future. And for those people, as soon as they arrive, they should be detained quickly, and then they should be given a choice to return to their own country if they think it's safe, or to have their asylum claim processed in Rwanda or any other country where we have a Rwanda-style agreement. And we think there would need to be some changes made in our human rights laws to do those things.
Right.
And we think there's a possibility that we might need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights to get it done.
OK, what's the evidence that there's a huge appetite in Parliament or even in the government to do that?
No, I'm not saying that I think the government is going to go there. What we've said in the report is there are things that can be done consistent with our membership of the ECHR that might be able to facilitate the things that we're proposing in the report. But it might also be that in the end, ECHR rulings mean that it isn't possible to deliver unless we are prepared to withdraw.
If somebody arrives on our shores, there is a human right that they can claim asylum, because the vast majority of people who do claim asylum when they arrive here, those asylum applications are granted.
Yes, they can claim asylum, and this is why the proposal is not to say that they can't claim asylum, but it is to facilitate their asylum claim in another country, like Rwanda, because we have to break the incentive to make these journeys across the Channel. If we break the incentive, fewer people will travel in this way. The business models of the gangs who facilitate the travel will be broken, and then we can talk about how generous we can be through resettlement schemes where people can apply in an orderly way.
Henry, are you in favour of leaving the European Convention on Human Rights?
I think if we don't leave, it needs to be reformed in terms of how Britain applies to the ECHR. Many countries who are members of the ECHR just ignore their judgments anyway. But I think it's very instructive that countries like Sweden, for example, Germany, have been able to, for example, reject claims from Albania, which is an EU candidate country, and I would argue, you know, a safe country.
But you don't need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights to set up that bilateral agreement with Albania.
So that's my point. I think there are. I think this report is very interesting. I think there are a lot of good things in this report. But this is the number one issue in my email inbox, and understandably so, because I think people feel it's patently unfair that you can just cross the Channel in a dinghy, not least unsafe and also, frankly, fueling people smuggling. And we need a fair immigration system which applies equally to all.
Nancy?
The system doesn't work. The system is broken. There are people who need asylum here who are kept in awful circumstances, who are facing being to Rwanda, who probably would get permission to stay and should get it quickly, but that's not what happens. This is a political hot potato that we've had promises made on, and actually the problem is just getting worse. We don't need more reports that stir up the hate. We need investment in the system. We need the system to work. We need people to move faster through it, and we do need to make sure that people are not scared for their lives, so that they're getting in dinghies and risking their lives. And I'm not saying everybody who does that should do it, and I'm not saying that everybody who does that has a right to be here, but we're getting promises and no actual action. Nothing has changed in years on this.
Do you think any of the policy suggestions, so this indefinite detention of all asylum seekers who enter the country illegally, should be cut right back? Rapid offshoring to Rwanda for all asylum seekers? Of course, that hasn't actually happened yet. The government blames the courts for it. Do you think these things are worth looking at?
I think everything is worth looking at, but I think there's also a lot of dangerous things in here. So we get to a point where we're full and we close the doors on people, no matter what the world situation is and what people are running from, because that's one of the suggestions in the report. But everything needs looking at completely afresh, because we're just making this worse and worse.
Peter?
Well, the courts, of course, would cut all this to ribbons if anyone tried to put it into practice. And we've seen from Pushback and Rwanda and Theresa May's pantechnicons going around London shouting "go home" at people. None of this works.
So is deterrent not the approach then, and collaboration is?
There's one thing that will undoubtedly work if we only pursue it with enough decision, and that is to get France to stop these people leaving France in the first place. It is absolutely the only route out. I went down, a colleague of mine lives down near the beaches where many people come ashore. The idea that everybody who comes ashore is processed is ludicrous. Huge numbers of people are coming ashore and they're completely unobserved, and they simply disappear into the country. Once people get into a boat on the Channel, they're here. Once they're here, they'll usually stay. The only thing to do is to treat it as a land border, which effectively it is now. The Channel's lost its psychological fear barrier, and treat it as a land border and make sure that our next door neighbour in France actually prevents people from going.
And how do you do that?
Well, you pay them.
But the UK government is paying them.
I don't mind how much you pay them. France is a pretty strongly governed country. If France wants to stop people leaving France to go across the Channel, they will stop them. But we have to make them do so, and we have to induce them. There's no other serious policy. I don't know why anybody is even bothering to consider it. That would work, but you have to do it with resolve, and you have to show the French you mean it, and you have to pay them enough to do it. Huge use of the French state.
Yeah.
Enormous numbers of people involved, but we have to get them to do it.
Ben?
Well, it's made more difficult, of course, by our exclusion from the Dublin Convention, which is a result of Brexit, which you could actually try to renegotiate back into. However, I think there are two main. I think there are two main problems with this, as I understand it, and I haven't read the full report. One is that there's no effective system for dealing with asylum applications at the moment. The system is completely broken down, and people are waiting months, if not years, to have their claim assessed. And as you said in your interview with Nick Timothy, the vast majority of whom get asylum in the end. The second issue is there are no safe routes. When Suella Braverman was before the Home Affairs Select Committee, she was asked by a Conservative member, how does a 16-year-old orphan from East Africa come and join a brother in this country? She couldn't actually tell him how that would be done. I'm trying to get some relatives of Afghan constituents of mine who work for the British military in Afghanistan to get asylum in this country, which they're entitled to, according to the government. Four, since we withdrew from Afghanistan, have been granted asylum. It simply is not working. Fix the system first, then come up with all these highfalutin ideas, most of which are complete pie in the sky, but fix the system as it should be operating first.
Right. I mean, Henry, how would a young boy from East Africa, as Ben uses the example, come here safely, orphaned, has no other option where he is? How does he come here via a safe and legal route?
Well, there are safe routes to this country. There's the Hong Kong scheme. There's the Afghan resettlement scheme. I've got 2 hotels in my constituency that are still full of Afghan refugees that have come here through the various Afghan schemes that exist. There have been direct transfers from refugee camps of Syrian refugees, so that there are direct routes. But I agree that the system isn't obviously working at the moment. It's not working for the taxpayer. It's not working for those who are genuinely seeking asylum. And, you know, it's not working for those people who are going through the immigration system, paying the immigration fees and so forth.
All right, well, we've all agreed that the system isn't working. Well, we've all agreed it's not working. It's not working to some extent. So which bits of the report would you actually take on?
Well, I haven't had an opportunity to read the report, but certainly from the introduction that I saw, I think there are some really good ideas in there, and I think that is worth pursuing.
Right.
Because this is a concern that, as far as my constituents tell me, and I understand why, is their number one issue.
Peter?
Well, one really bad idea in it is identity cards, but leaving those aside, the thing that never gets asked in this discussion is exactly why anybody from East Africa, if they are a refugee or they're seeking asylum, comes here in the first place. How many safe countries are there between East Africa and Britain?
Well,
I mean, quite a few.
The example that was given by this Conservative MP was because they had a relative here.
If they are, well, but why was the relative here? If they are refugees, why do they come here? This is economic migration. I admire the people who do it enormously. I admire their energy, their spirit, their determination to make these extraordinary journeys. But they are not. We should not regard them or discuss them as refugees or asylum seekers.
So the people who work for the British military in Afghanistan that you're calling economic migrants.
I'm not going.
Their lives are at risk on a daily basis.
I'm not doing that.
How do you know a boy in East Africa isn't in,
East Africa is
in a war zone?
East Africa is not in Afghanistan. He may be in a war zone.
A lot of East Africa is in war zones at the moment.
Just a second. The reason why we have obligations in Afghanistan is because we poked our nose into Afghanistan, sent troops there, and in general intervened in a way which gave us obligations. I don't myself believe we should have done so, but I agree with you that where we obtained obligations there to people, we should fulfil them. That is totally separate, as you well know, from the question of huge numbers of people coming from countries which have no connection with this country whatsoever.
Talking about huge numbers of people, these are individuals, and that's an example of one person who might need to get here. You can't tell everybody to say, push. This is why the system is so broken, because let's not have the people who shouldn't be here, but let's find a way of helping those who shouldn't are desperately need. We do need a middle ground.
I'm not against that, but the discussion has to be intelligent. We have to stop pretending, as many people who favour this immigration do, that these people are here because, for the most part, they're refugees or seeking asylum. They are economic migrants, and they should be treated
why
as
do
such.
most of them get asylum, then? Why do most of them, even the small boat, ones coming in small boats across the Dover Straits, why do most of those get asylum?
Because of the state of the law.
Meaning?
So those
I
individuals...
mean, that's what the law says should happen, and we are a law-governed country.
You can't get
and
asylum
very
unless you have
difficult.
good grounds to fear persecution. I mean, have you ever sat in an asylum court?
Well, no, I haven't, but
Well,
I don't know what that has to do with it.
I mean, if we're talking about the issue of deterrent, that is what this report is aimed to do.
There are lots of pulls, and actually I disagree with Peter Hitchens on almost everything, including identity cards, actually. I think one of the reasons we have big pull factors in this country is that you can just disappear into our
black market
and find work very easily because we have chronic labour shortages.
Yeah,
you can't do that in Germany.
And if we have identity cards, the same thing will happen, only we'll all have identity cards as well. It won't solve that problem. It will just be an extra burden on the people living in this country already.
One of the proposals is a statutory cap, Henry. No more than 20,000 per year on the numbers coming to Britain through the resettlement routes that exist. But just to put that in a bit of context, last year, through that route, 89,000 Ukrainians, 76,000 from Hong Kong and 21,000 Afghans arrived in the UK. That cap's not achievable, is it?
Well, you said from the introduction on that report that I think Nick Timothy was saying Parliament could fluctuate that under his proposals, and that's exactly what we've seen. What I do know is that net migration of over 500,000 people a year is not sustainable. It's not sustainable in terms of housing. It's not sustainable in terms of public services. It's not sustainable, actually, in terms of social cohesion. And therefore, we do have to get a grip of our immigration system so that immigration works for us where we need the economy, jobs in the economy filled, but at the same time, it is a fair system that treats everybody equally and the taxpayer. The fact that we're paying millions every day for a broken system is clearly something that isn't working, and it needs to be resolved.
Is he right?
No, let's get the nuts and bolts working first before we start talking about imaginary caps. I mean, this is the whole problem with the government's approach. It keeps going on about, we're going to do this, we're going to have this target, we're going to do that. Fix the system as it should be working now.
Right,
so we should follow the example of the Labour government of
no.
1997 to 2010 and its immigration record, should we?
Well,
we were in the EU, of course, and there was freedom of movement.
It was a time when we had sustained economic growth, investment in our public services, low unemployment, and actually, compared with now, it feels like a golden age, Peter.
All right.
Only to you.
Let's talk about wind farms. The Times. Tory voters back wind farms even close to home. Now, the article says there is overwhelming support for overturning the ban on onshore wind farms with no marked difference among Tory voters. Do you agree, Henry, with lifting the ban?
I think it should be up to local communities as to whether they want wind turbines in their neck of the woods or not. I think it's been phenomenal. The offshore, the offshore wind, I think, produced last week more than 50% of our energy. So I think there is potential for wind turbines, but it has to be with the express permission of local communities.
So will you add your name?
We don't want to see
yes.
wind turbines destroying the beauty of our landscape. There is a balance to be had. So I would envisage onshore wind farms being in very limited circumstances.
Would you sign the amendment by your colleague Simon Clarke to lift that ban?
I haven't seen that amendment, so I'd have to read.
Well, there is an amendment saying that the ban should be lifted on new wind farms. Would you sign that or not?
I probably wouldn't, because I think the system right now works where mass offshore wind farms are actually producing a lot of clean energy. And I do worry that in a crowded countryside, onshore wind creates problems.
We face a climate emergency. We're being held to ransom by Putin over energy, and the cheapest, quickest way of generating renewable energy is onshore wind. There's currently a ban. So, for goodness sake, at least lift the ban and let local councils. In my county of Devon, the local authorities want to do this. They had a citizens' consultation, overwhelmingly in favour. People get this now. The Tories are way out of date on onshore wind, and this country should not be held to ransom by a very small number of people who object to what they look like. This is an emergency, guys. Let's get real.
Would you support them on Dartmoor, for example?
I think I've seen wind farms on beautiful Scottish uplands, which are actually when I feel they're contributing to our energy security and tackling the climate emergency, it wouldn't stop me walking on Dartmoor and admiring the beauty of Dartmoor, no.
Oh, and what happens when the wind isn't blowing very much?
Well, then you don't get any electricity. And these things cost an awful lot. If taking, which I don't, but assuming that the arguments of the wind farm enthusiasts are true, the actual energy produced, a lot of it quite dirty, in making them is enormous. The difficulty in disposing of them when they stop working, which they do quite quickly, is also a huge difficulty. Large parts of the year they don't work at all. They can only function with enormous subsidies.
I don't know about large parts of the year, but of course if the wind isn't blowing, well, if the wind isn't blowing, well, I will check it because I don't know. That's why I said.
Last year when they didn't, and also they don't produce a vital part of the generation system's needs, which is inertia, which can only be produced by nuclear power or coal-fired power. It doesn't. Wind power won't do it, and if you don't have inertia, you get power cuts. The reason our power works at the moment is because we use an awful lot of gas, which everybody pretends is a clean fuel, and because we import enormous amounts of electricity particularly from France. And a lot of the electricity, probably this studio is functioning on French nuclear energy as we sit here.
Well, it's not functioning on a wind farm, I can tell you that much.
Nancy? Or we'd be in the dark.
As you know, it might be.
A little joke. Nancy?
I can see a wind farm out of my bedroom window. I actually quite like it. I like that feeling that we're doing something positive.
Absolutely.
It doesn't destroy the environment in the way that many, many things do. And I think if people were given an option, lots of people want that. I don't really understand why there would be an overall ban on it. Yeah, let's not put them in beautiful areas that are protected already for their wildlife and their look, but let's look at every option to get on top of climate.
A lot of people don't like living next to them for lots of reasons, and you might not if you live next to them. And
I do.
How next?
I can see it out the windows. I can't tell you
how far away is it?
Well, I couldn't give you a metre.
Well, give me in yards, miles, whatever it is.
No, it's not miles. It's not less than a mile.
Less than a mile. I think a lot of people live with them a lot closer than that. The other thing about when you build wind farms, you have to connect them to the grid. It's immensely expensive and difficult to do, and it also raises huge planning difficulties.
What would you do to solve the climate?
Well, I wouldn't have blown up all our coal-fired power stations
We've
myself.
done that now.
I know we
How
have,
do you move
but as it
forward?
is, what we need to do is to build a very rapidly a new fleet of nuclear power stations to take up the slack. Well, you can. You don't have to follow the vast model that we're constantly following. There are smaller types of nuclear power stations.
Would you want that in your neighbourhood?
Absolutely, in preference to wind farm, yes, definitely. Apart from anything else, it would produce electricity most of the time.
And what about this issue when the wind isn't blowing? What do you do then? Well, you've got to have electricity backup, haven't you?
Yeah, storage technology is getting much, much better all the time. Battery technology is getting better. But as Henry said, you know, I think for most of this week, half of our energy is being generated by off or onshore wind. And given how little onshore wind we have, half of that being generated onshore is pretty good. If you had more onshore, we'd be more independent, we'd be doing more to tackle climate change. And I think Nancy's absolutely right. The vast majority of people want this. It's held back by an out-of-date policy. How old is it now? 10 years? 12 years old? And it's time to revisit it. I've signed that amendment, and I hope Henry will leave the studio today and go and sign it too.
Oh, are you going to do that after this discussion?
I'm hot-footing it as we speak.
Here's my pen. Here's my pen.
But I think we need an energy mix, and I think nuclear is part of that, and I think transitioning hydrocarbons as well is part of that, as is offshore wind and other technology as well. I think we have abundance of natural resources in this country, and I think we need a mix, not only for energy security, but actually for the environmental impact of producing energy. And onshore wind turbines, they're not a zero environmental impact. You can't recycle the wind turbines when they break. They have to be buried, I understand, at the moment, which isn't the most sustainable thing to do. There's also issues in terms of bird strike as well, damaging wildlife.
What about the state of the Conservative Party? I mean, this issue does seem to have rather divided the party, putting pressure on Rishi Sunak to stand firm on the ban in favour of greater offshore wind. Are the Conservatives in civil war over this?
I don't think. Well, I wasn't aware of this amendment, so I don't think.
Oh, well,
I don't think it's. I don't think it's a bit. I don't think it's. No, I don't. I don't think it's. I just watch BBC Politics Live. Absolutely.
Well done.
I think it needs an energy mix, and I don't think this is an issue that's certainly talking about my email inbox. This certainly isn't an issue that is high up there at all.
Do you think it's going to happen though? The ban will be lifted.
Well, if the government brings this levelling up bill back at all, because there's another issue that's tearing the government apart on planning and housing targets. If it brings it back, we will vote for this amendment, and it will go through because it will have a majority. We also have a stronger Labour amendment that we'll vote for as well, because we don't think this amendment goes far enough.
That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests for today's programme. I'll be back tomorrow at 12:15 with more Politics Live. Bye-bye.